last week, so we didn't do Sunday, but on Wednesday, where we left off, um Sophie, Michael, and Hal were about to go through the black door, the one that Sophie's been curious about. I think we did chapters 9 and 10. Sophie and Michael were trying to complete that spell. So they tried to catch a falling star with the 7 league boots. What else happened? I feel like a lot happened, but I can't remember it all. Hal convinced Sophie to go meet the king for him. To go convince the king that she is his mother and that he shouldn't be trusted with trying to find his brother. He also, I think, was a bit depressed about Letty. And he said that the spell that Michael was trying to do wasn't the one that he left behind for him and must have come through the door when Sophie had opened it. So that's where we left off. And they were about to go through the door. And Sophie's all excited and curious. We're up to chapter 11. So we're exactly halfway at this point. I mean, it doesn't look as perfectly halfway, but chapter-wise, we are halfway. Chapter 11, in which Howl goes to a strange country in search of a spell. The nothingness was only inch thick after all. Beyond it, in a grey, drizzling evening, was a cement path down to a garden gate. Howl and Michael were waiting at the gate. Beyond that was a flat, hard-looking road lined with houses on both sides. Sophie looked back at where she had come from, shivering rather in the drizzle, and found the castle had become a house of yellow brick with large windows. Like all the other houses, it was square and new, with a front door of wobbly glass. Nobody seemed to be about among the houses. That may have been due to the drizzle, but Sophie had a feeling that it was really because, in spite of there being so many houses, this was somewhere at the edge of town. "When you've quite finished nosing," Hal called. His grey and scarlet finery was all misted with drizzle. He was dangling a bunch of strange keys, most of which were flat and yellow, and seemed to match the houses. When Sophie came down the path, he said, "We need to be dressed in keeping with this place." His finery blurred, as if the drizzle round him had suddenly become a fog. When it came into focus again, it was still scarlet and grey, but quite a different shape. The dangling sleeves had gone, and the whole outfit was baggier. It looked worn and shabby. Michael's jacket had become a waist-length padded thing. He lifted his foot with a canvas shoe on it and stared at the tight blue things encasing his legs. Sorry, my cat is being loud. "I can hardly bend my knee," he said. "You'll get used to it," said Hal. "Come on, Sophie." To Sophie's surprise, Hal led the way back up the garden path toward the yellow house. The back of his baggy jacket, she saw, had mysterious words on it. Welsh rugby. Michael followed Hal, walking in a kind of tight strut because of the things on his legs. Sophie looked down at herself and saw twice as much skinny legs showing above her knobbly shoes. Otherwise, not much about her had changed. Hal unlocked the wavy glass door with one of his keys. It had a wooden notice hanging beside it on chains. "Rivendell," Sophie read, as Hal pushed her into a neat, shiny hall space. There seemed to be people in the house. Loud voices were coming from behind the nearest door. When Hal opened that door, Sophie realized that the voices were coming from magic-colored pictures moving on the front of a big square box. "Howl!" exclaimed a woman who was sitting there knitting. She put down her knitting, looking a little annoyed. Before she could get up, A small girl who had been watching the magic picture very seriously, with her chin in her hands, leaped up and flung herself at Howl. Uncle Howl, she screamed, and jumped halfway up Howl with her legs wrapped around him. Mari, Howl bawled in reply. How are you, Cariad? Been a good girl, then? He and the little girl broke into a foreign language then, fast and loud. Sophie could see they were very special to one another. She wondered about the language. It sounded the same as Calcifer's silly saucepan song, but it was hard to be sure. In between bursts of foreign chatter, Hal managed to say as if he were a ventriloquist, This is my niece, Mari, and my sister, Megan Parry. Megan, this is Michael Fisher, and Sophie, Hatter, said Sophie. Megan shook hands with both of them in a strained, disapproving way. She was older than Hal, but quite like him, with the same long, angular face. But her eyes were blue and full of anxieties, and her hair was darkish. Quiet now, Mari, she said, in a voice that cut through the foreign chatter. Howl, are you staying long? Just dropped in for a moment, Hal said, lowering Mari to the floor. Gareth isn't in yet, Megan said, in a meaning sort of way. What a pity we can't stay, Hal said, smiling a warm, false smile. I just thought I'd introduce you to my friends here, and I want to ask you something that may sound silly. Has Neil by any chance lost a piece of English homework lately? Funny you should say that, Megan exclaimed, looking everywhere for it. He was last Thursday. He got this new English teacher, see, and she's very strict. Doesn't just worry about spelling either. Puts the fear of God into them about getting work in on time. Doesn't do Neil any harm, lazy little devil. So here he is on Thursday, hunting high and low, and all he can find is a funny old piece of writing. Ah, said Hal. What did he do with that writing? I told him to hand it in to this Miss Angorian of his, Megan said. Might show her he tried for one. And did he? Hal asked. I don't know. Better ask Neil. He's up in the front bedroom with that machine of his, said Megan. But you won't get a word of sense out of him. Come on, Hal said to Michael and Sophie, who were both staring around the shiny brown and orange room. He took Murray's hand and led them all out of the room and up the stairs. Even those had a carpet, a pink and green one, for the procession led by Hal made hardly any noise as it went along the pink and green passage upstairs and into a room with a blue and yellow carpet. Tea break. Hi, Lime Rants 5. Thank you, Sophie. The one. Ooh. Sorry, my screen went all fuzzy for a second. This is the shirt Dorian gave me. But Sophie was not sure the two boys crouched over the various magic boxes on a big table by the window would have looked up even for an army with a brass band. The main magic box had a glass front like the one downstairs, but it seemed to be showing writing and diagrams more than pictures. All the boxes grew on long, floppy white stalks that appeared to be rooted in the wall at one side of the room. Neil, said Hal. Don't interrupt, one of the boys said. He'll lose his life. Seeing it was a matter of life and death, Sophie and Michael backed toward the door. But Hal, quite unperturbed at killing his nephew, strode over to the wall and pulled the boxes up by the roots. The picture on the box vanished. Both boys said words which Sophie did not think even Martha knew. The second boy spun round, shouting, Mari, I'll get you for that. Wasn't me this time, so, Mari shouted back. Neil whirled further around and stared accusingly at Hal. How do, Neil? Hal said pleasantly. Who is he? The other boy asked. My no-good uncle, Neil said. He glowered at Hal. He was dark with thick eyebrows and his glower was impressive. What do you want? Put that plug back in. There's a welcome in the valleys, said. I'll put it back when I've asked you something and you've answered. Neil sighed. Uncle Howl, I'm in the middle of a computer game. A new one? Asked Hal. Both the boys looked disconcerted. No, it's one I had for Christmas, Neil said. You ought to know the way you go on about wasting time and money on useless things. They won't give me another till my birthday." "Then that's easy," said Hal. "You won't mind stopping if you've done it before, and I'll bribe you with a new one." "Really?" both boys said eagerly, and Neil added, "Can you make it another of those that nobody else has got?" "Yes, but just take a look at this first and tell me what it is," Hal said, and he held the shiny grey paper out in front of Neil. Both boys looked at it. Neil said, "It's a poem," in the way most people would say, "It's a dead rat." "It's the one Miss Angorian set for last week's homework," said the other boy. "I remember. Wind and Finned. It's about submarines." While Sophie and Michael blinked at this new theory, wondering how they had missed it, Neil exclaimed, "Hey, it's my long-lost homework. Where did you find it? Was that funny writing that turned up yours? Miss Angorian said it was interesting, lucky for me, and she took it home with her." "Thank you," said Hal. "Where does she live?" "That flat over Mrs. Phillips' tea shop. Cardiff Road," said Neil. "When will you give me the new tape?" "When you remember how the rest of the poem goes," said Hal. "That's not fair," said Neil. "I can't even remember the bit that was written down now. That's just playing with a person's feelings." He stopped when Hal laughed, felt in one baggy pocket, and handed him a flat packet. "Thanks," Neil said devoutly, and without more ado, he whirled around to his magic boxes. Hal planted the bundle of roots back in the wall, grinning, and beckoned Michael and Sophie out of the room. Both boys began a flurry of mysterious activity into which Mari somehow squeezed herself, watching with her thumb in her mouth. Hal hurried away to the pink and green stairs, but Michael and Sophie both hung about near the door of the room, wondering what the whole thing was about. Inside, Neil was reading aloud. "You are in an enchanted castle with 4 doors. Each opens on a different dimension. In Dimension 1, the castle is moving constantly and may arrive at a hazard at any time." Sophie wondered at the familiarity of this as she hobbled to the stairs. She found Michael standing halfway down, looking embarrassed. Hal was at the foot of the stairs having an argument with his sister. "What do you mean you've sold all my books?" she heard Hal saying. "I needed one of them particularly. They weren't yours to sell." "Don't keep interrupting," Megan answered in a low, ferocious voice. "Listen now. I've told you before. I'm not a storehouse for your property. You're a disgrace to me and Gareth, lounging about in those clothes instead of buying a proper suit and looking respectable for once. Taking up with riffraff and layabouts, bringing them to this house. Are you trying to bring me down to your level? You had all that education, and you don't even get a decent job. You just hang around, wasting all that time at college, wasting all those sacrifices other people made, wasting your money." Megan would have been a match for Mrs. Fairfax. Her voice went on and on. Sophie began to understand how Hal had acquired the habit of slithering out. Megan was the kind of person who made you want to back quietly out of the nearest door. Unfortunately, Hal was backed up against the stairs, and Sophie and Michael were bottled up behind him. "Never doing an honest day's work, never getting a job I could be proud of, bringing shame on me and Gareth, coming here and spoiling Murray Rotten," Megan ground on remorselessly. Sophie pushed Michael aside and stumped downstairs, looking as stately as she could manage. "Come, Hal," she said grandly. "We really must be on our way. While we stand here, money is ticking away, and your servants are probably selling the gold plate. So nice to meet you," she said to Megan as she arrived at the foot of the stairs. "But we must rush. Hal is such a busy man." Megan gulped a bit and stared at Sophie. Sophie gave her a stately nod and pushed Hal toward the wavy glass front door. Michael's face was bright red. Sophie saw that because Hal turned back to ask Megan, "Is my old car still in the shed, or have you sold that too?" He answered down. "That seems to be the only buy." The front door slammed and Hal took them to a building at the end of the flat black road. "Hal don't know what to say about Megan," he said as he unlocked a wide door in the building. "The English teacher was bound to copy the book." Sophie wished to forget the next bit. They rode horses at a terrifying speed, smelling and growling, shaking, as it tore down one of the steepest roads ever seen. A road so steep she wondered why the houses might not slide into a heap at the bottom. Shut her eyes and clung to some of the pieces and simply hoped it would be over soon. Again. Oh, does the sound cut out? Hmm. Can you guys hear me again? I think it might be the time that I am doing this at. I might have to maybe do it a bit earlier or a bit later if it keeps doing this, because I think it's just the internet usage. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong here. Yeah. I'm sorry guys if it keeps doing that. Do you get the general gist of what's going on right now? If not, I can give you a mild recap. Yeah, it is. It is peak hour. The first few streams, like, it was fine though. So I thought maybe it'd just be chill. I don't know. If it keeps going like this for the rest of the stream, I'll change it to maybe 9 to 10. You think that would be better? We'll see. We'll see. Let me know if it drops out again. I'll try and like look at the chat more frequently. I just got really into this bit. I sound fine now? Okay. It did come up with an error screen when I looked up. It was like all red. Okay. So Amir, you say you can hear me, but Sophie can't. I don't know. Sophie, it's saying it's all fine on my side now. It did when you initially mentioned something, say there was an error. Okay. So it could just be good for you. All right. Well, after this stream, I will probably start doing it at 9 o'clock instead. Yeah. All right. For now, I will keep going. And if it's real bad, we'll just stop. Yeah. Just let me know again. I usually can see it if it goes red. Otherwise, just spam me. Just keep saying that it's, and I'll be able to see the motion of the chat moving. I'll continue. She shut her eyes and clung to some of the pieces that had torn off the seats and simply hoped it would be over soon. Lucky it was. They arrived in a flatter road with houses crammed in on both sides. Beside a large window filled with a white curtain and a notice that said, "Teas closed." But despite this forbidding notice, when Hal pressed a button at a small door beside the window, Miss Angorian opened the door. They all stared at her. For a fierce schoolteacher, Miss Angorian was astonishingly young and slender and good-looking. She had sheets of blue-black hair hanging around her olive-brown, heart-shaped face and enormous dark eyes. The only thing which suggested fierceness about her was the direct and clever way those enormous eyes looked and seemed to sum them up. "I'll take a small guess that you may be Howl Jenkins," Miss Angorian said to Hal. She had a low, melodious voice that was nevertheless rather amused and quite sure of itself. Hal was taken aback for an instant, then his smile snapped on, and that, Sophie thought, was goodbye to the pleasant dreams of Letty and Mrs. Fairfax. For Miss Angorian was exactly the kind of lady someone like Hal could be trusted to fall in love with on the spot. And not only Hal, Michael was staring admiringly too. And though all the houses around were apparently deserted, Sophie had no doubt that they were full of people who all knew both Hal and Miss Angorian and were watching with interest to see what would happen. She could feel their invisible eyes. Market shipping was like that too. And you must be Miss Angorian, said Hal. I'm sorry to bother you, but I made a stupid mistake last week and carried off my nephew's English homework instead of a rather important paper I had with me. I gather Neil gave it to you as proof that he wasn't shirking. He did, said Miss Angorian. He'd better come in and collect it. Sophie was sure the invisible eyes in all the houses goggled and the invisible necks craned as Hal and Michael and she trooped in through Miss Angorian's door and up a flight of stairs to Miss Angorian's tiny, severe living room. Miss Angorian said considerately to Sophie, "Won't you sit down?" Sophie was still shaking from that horseless carriage. She sat down gladly on one of the two chairs. It was not very comfortable. Miss Angorian's room was not designed for comfort, but for study. Though many of the things in it were strange, Sophie understood the walls of books and the piles of paper on the table and the folders stacked on the floor. She sat and watched Michael staring sheepishly, and Hal turning on his charm. "How is it you come to know who I am?" Hal said beguilingly. "You seem to have caused a lot of gossip in this town," Miss Angorian said, busy sorting through the papers on the table. "And what have those people who gossiped told you?" Hal asked. He leaned languishingly on the end of the table and tried to catch Miss Angorian's eye. "That you disappear and turn up rather unpredictably, for one thing," Miss Angorian said. "And what else?" Hal followed. Miss Angorian's movements with such a look, Sophie knew Letty's only chance was for Miss Angorian to fall instantly in love with Hal too. But Miss Angorian was not that kind of lady. She said many other things, few of them to your credit, and caused Michael to blush by looking at him, and then at Sophie, in a way that suggested these things were not fit for their ears. She held a yellowish, wavy-edged paper out to Hal. "Here it is," she said severely. "Do you know what it is?" "Of course," said Hal. "Then please tell me," said Miss Angorian. Hal took the paper. There was a bit of a scuffle as he tried to take Miss Angorian's hand with it. Miss Angorian won the scuffle and put her hands behind her back. Hal smiled meltingly and passed the paper to Michael. "You tell her," he said. Michael's blushing face lit up as soon as he looked at it. "It's the spell! Oh, I can do this one. It's enlargement, isn't it?" "That's what I thought," Miss Angorian said rather accusingly. "I'd like to know what you were doing with such a thing." "Miss Angorian," said Hal, "if you have heard of all those things about me, you must know I wrote my doctoral thesis on charms and spells. You look as if you suspect me of working black magic. I assure you, I never worked any kind of spell in my life." Sophie could not stop herself making a small snort at this blatant lie. "With my hand on my heart," Hal added, giving Sophie an irritated frown. "This spell is for study purposes only. It's very old and rare. That's why I wanted it back." "Well, you have it back," Miss Angorian said briskly. "Before you go, would you mind giving me my homework sheet in return? Photocopies cost money." Hal brought out the grey paper willingly and held it just out of reach. "This poem now," he said. "It's been bothering me. Silly, really, but I can't remember the rest of it. By Walter Raleigh, isn't it?" Miss Angorian gave him a withering look. "Certainly not. It's by John Donne, and it's very well known indeed. I have the book with it in here. You want to refresh your memory?" "Please," said Hal, and from the way his eyes followed Miss Angorian as she went to her wall of books, Sophie realized that this was the real reason why Hal had come into this strange land where his family lived. But Hal was not above killing two birds with one stone. "Miss Angorian," he said pleadingly, following her contours as she stretched for the book, "would you consider coming out for some supper with me tonight?" Miss Angorian turned round with the large book in her hands, looking more severe than ever. "I would not," she said. "Mr. Jenkins, I don't know what you've heard about me, but you must have heard that I still consider myself engaged to Ben Sullivan." "Never heard of him," said Hal. "My fiancé," said Miss Angorian. "He disappeared some years back. Now do you wish me to read this poem out to you?" "Do that," Hal said, quite unrepentant. "You have such a lovely voice." "Then I'll start with the second verse," Miss Angorian said, "since you have the first verse there in your hand." She read very well, not only melodiously, but in a way which made the sound verse fit the rhythm of the first, which in Sophie's opinion did not do at all. If you beast born to strange sights, things invisible to see, ride 10,000 days and nights, till age snow white hairs on thee. Thou, when thou return'st, wilt tell me all strange wonders that befell thee, and swear nowhere lives a woman true and fair, if thou— Hal had gone a terrible white. Sophie could see sweat standing on his face. Thank you, he said. Stop there. I won't trouble you for the rest. Even the good woman is untrue in the last verse, isn't she? I remember now. Silly of me. John Donne, of course. Miss Angorian lowered the book and stared at him. He forced up a smile. We must be going now. Sure you won't change your mind about supper? I will not, said Miss Angorian. Are you quite well, Miss Jenkins? In the pink, Hal said, and he hustled Michael and Sophie away, down the stairs, and into the horrible horseless carriage. The invisible watchers in the houses must have thought Miss Angorian was chasing them with a sabre, if they judged from the speed with which Hal packed them into it and drove off. What's the matter? Michael asked as the carriage went roaring and grinding uphill again, and Sophie clung to bits of seat for dear life. Hal pretended not to hear, so Michael waited until Hal was locking it into its shed and asked again. Oh, nothing, Hal said airily, leading the way back to the yellow house called Rivendell. The Witch of the Waste has caught up with me, with her curse, that's all, bound to happen sooner or later. He seems to be calculating or doing sums in his head while he opened the garden gate. 10,000, Sophie heard him murmur. That brings it to about Midsummer Day. What is brought to Midsummer Day? Sophie. The time I'll be 10,000 days old, Hal said. And that, Mrs. Knows, he said, swinging into the garden of Rivendell, is the day I shall have to go back to the Witch of the Waste. Sophie and Michael hung back on the path, staring at Hal's back, so mysteriously labelled Welsh Rugby. If I keep clear of mermaids, they heard him mutter, and don't touch a mandrake. Michael called out, Do we have to go back into that house? And Sophie called, What will the witch do? Shudder to think, Hal said. You don't have to go back in, Michael. He opened the wavy glass door. Inside was the familiar room of the castle. Calcifer's sleepy flames were colouring the walls faintly blue-green in the dusk. Hal flung back his long sleeves and gave Calcifer a log. He caught up, old Blueface, he said. I know, said Calcifer. I felt it take. And that is chapter 11. I need to move my feet, pins and needles. Ooh, ugh. I stupidly sat cross-legged and now I can't feel them. Like they're completely gone. I cannot feel my foot. Oh, it's fine. We're fine. It'll come back. So that was interesting. I don't remember that chapter at all. It was, they clearly went back to our world, which I had forgotten was a thing. Rip to me, yeah, it is rip to me. It's really unpleasant, actually. Yeah, so they were in Wales, which is really cool. In the, I won't say anything about the film because Amir hasn't seen it yet. But that is not a thing. Not a thing in the film. I'm taking a lot more tea breaks today because my throat is I don't think it's Miss Rona, but is a bit itchy right now. Just a cold. So we're up to chapter 12, in which Sophie becomes Hal's old mother, which we have been waiting for since last week. Sophie did not see much point in blackening Hal's name to the king, now that the witch had caught up with him. But Hal said it was more important than ever. I shall need everything I've got just to escape the witch. I can't have the king after me as well. So the following afternoon, Sophie put on her new clothes and sat feeling very fine, if rather stiff, waiting for Michael to get ready and for Hal to finish in the bathroom. Ugh. No, sorry. My feet, like, it's really uncomfortable. Oh, remind me to never sit like that during a stream again. It felt fine for the first 10 minutes. Okay. While she waited, she told Calcifer about the strange country where Hal's family lived. It took her mind off the king. Calcifer was very interested. I knew he came from foreign parts, he said, but this sounds like another world. Clever of the witch to send the curse in from there. Very clever all round. That's magic I admire, using something that exists anyway and turning it round in a curse. I did wonder about it when you and Michael were reading it the other day. That fool Howl told her too much about himself. Sophie gazed at Calcifer's thin blue face. It did not surprise her to find Calcifer admired the curse, any more than it surprised her when he called Howl a fool. He was always insulting Howl, but she never could work out if Calcifer really hated Howl. Calcifer looked so evil anyway that it was hard to tell. Calcifer moved his orange eyes to look into Sophie's. I'm scared too, he said. I shall suffer with Howl if the witch catches him. If you don't break the contract before she does, I won't be able to help you at all. Before Sophie could ask more, Hal came dashing out of the bathroom, looking his very finest, scenting the room with roses and yelling for Michael. Michael clattered downstairs in his new blue velvet. Sophie stood up and collected her rusty stick. It was time to go. You look wonderfully rich and stately, Michael said to her. She does me credit, said Hal, apart from that awful old stick. Some people, said Sophie, are thoroughly self-centered. This stick goes with me. I need it for moral support. Hal looked at the ceiling, but he did not argue. They took their stately way into the streets of Kingsbury. Sophie, of course, looked back to see that the castle was like here. She saw a big arched gateway surrounding a small black door. The rest of the castle seemed to be a blank stretch of plastered wall between two carved stone houses. Before you ask, said Hal, it's really just a disused stable. This way. They walked through the streets looking at least as fine as any of the passers-by. Not that many people were about. Kingsbury was a long way south, and it was a bakingly hot day there. The pavements shivered. Sophie discovered another disadvantage to being old. You felt queer in hot weather. The elaborate buildings wavered in front of her eyes. She was annoyed because she wanted to look at the place, but all she had was a dim impression of golden domes and tall houses. By the way, Hal said, Mrs. Penstamen will call you Mrs. Pendragon. Pendragon's the name I go under here. Whatever for, said Sophie. For disguise, said Hal. Pendragon's a lovely name, much better than Jenkins. I get by quite well with a plain name, Sophie said, as they turned into a blessedly narrow, cool street. We can't all be mad hatters, said Hal. Mrs. Pensman's house was gracious and tall near the end of the narrow street. It had orange trees in tubs on either side of its handsome front door. The door was opened by an elderly footman in black velvet, who led them into a wonderfully cool black and white checkered marble hall, where Michael tried secretly to wipe sweat off his face. Hal, who always seemed to be cool, treated the footman as an old friend and made jokes to him. The footman passed them on to a page boy in red velvet. Sophie, as the boy led them ceremoniously up polished stairs, began to see why this made good practice for meeting the king. She felt as if she were in a palace already. When the boy ushered them into a shaded drawing room, she was sure even a palace could not be this elegant. Everything in the room was blue and gold and white, and small and fine. Mrs. Penstamen was finest of all. She was tall and thin, and she sat bolt upright in a blue and gold embroidered chair, supporting herself rigidly with one hand in a gold mesh mitten on a gold topped. She wore old gold silk in a very stiff and old fashioned style, finished off with an old gold headdress, not unlike a crown, which tied in a large gold bow beneath her gaunt eagle face. She was the finest and most frightening lady Sophie had ever seen. Ah, my dear Howl, she said, holding a gold mesh mitten. I feel like I need to tell you guys that in the entire Wales scene, Howl was spelt differently. So it was Howell. And the rest of the time, it's just spelled Howl. So, fun fact. Another different name. And just then, it was spelt the same way that it was spelt in Wales. So, his teacher, who I'm assuming taught him magic first, calls him by his original name. So, the name that he goes by in the regular world, the world, our world. You understand. Hal bent and kissed the mitten, as he was obviously supposed to do. He did it very gracefully, but it was rather spoiled from back view by Hal flapping his other hand furiously at Michael behind his back. Michael, a little too slowly, realized he was supposed to stand by the door beside the page boy. He backed there in a hurry, only too pleased to get as far away from Mrs. Penstamen as he could. Mrs. Penstamen, allow me to present my old mother, Hal said, waving his hand at Sophie. Since Sophie felt just like Michael, Hal had to flap his hand at her too. Charmed, delighted, said Mrs. Penstamen, and she held her gold mitten out to Sophie. Sophie was not sure if Mrs. Penstamen meant her to kiss the mitten as well. She could not bring herself to try. She laid her own hand on the mitten instead. The hand under it felt like an old, cold claw. After feeling it, Sophie was quite surprised that Mrs. Penstamen was alive. Forgive my not standing up, Mrs. Pendragon, Mrs. Penstamen said. My health is not good. It forced me to retire from teaching 3 years ago. Pray sit down, both of you. Trying not to shake with nerves, Sophie sat grandly in the embroidered chair opposite Mrs. Penstamen's, supporting herself on her stick in what she hoped was the same elegant way. Hal spread himself gracefully in a chair next to it. He looked quite at home, and Sophie envied him. I am 86, Mrs. Penstamen announced. How old are you, my dear Mrs. Pendragon? 90, Sophie said, that being the first high number that came into her head. So old, Mrs. Penstamen said, with what may have been slight stately envy. How lucky you are to move so nimbly still. Oh, yes, she's so wonderfully nimble, Hal agreed, that sometimes there's no stopping her. If she's 90, isn't she a bit too old to be Hal's mum? Like, they should have planned this better. It's more likely that she'd be his grandma. Mrs. Penstamen gave him a look which told Sophie she had been a teacher at least as fierce as Miss Angorian. I am talking to your mother, she said. I dare say she is as proud of you as I am. I get to the right. Yes, okay. I dare say she is as proud of you as I am. We are two old ladies who both had a hand in forming you. You are, one might say, our joint creation. Don't you think I did any of me myself then? Hal asked. Put in just a few touches of my own. A few, and those not altogether to my liking, Mrs. Penstamen replied. But you will not wish to sit here and hear yourself being discussed. You will go down and sit on the terrace, taking your page boy with you, where Hunch will bring you both a cool drink. Go along. If Sophie had not been so nervous herself, she might have laughed at the expression on Hal's face. He had obviously not expected this to happen at all, but he got up with only a slight shrug, made a slight warning face at Sophie, and shooed Michael out of the room ahead of him. Mrs. Pensiman turned her rigid body very slightly to watch them go. Then she nodded at the page boy, who scuttled out of the room too. After that, Mrs. Pensiman turned herself back toward Sophie, and Sophie felt more nervous than ever. I prefer him with black hair, Mrs. Pensiman announced. That boy is going the bad. Who? Michael? Sophie said, bewildered. Not the servitor, said Mrs. Pensiman. I do not think he is clever enough to cause me concern. I am talking about Howl, Mrs. Pendragon. Oh, said Sophie, wondering why Mrs. Pensiman only said Howl had surely arrived at the bad long ago. His whole appearance, Mrs. Pensiman said sweepingly. Look at his clothes. He's very careful about his appearance. I wondered why he was putting his own. The phrase was, I am careful about my appearance too. I see no harm in that, Mrs. Pensiman. But what call has he found in a charmed suit? The diamond attraction. Directed at ladies, very well done. I admit, barely detected the trained eye. This appears to have been done to the scene, one which will render him almost equal to ladies. Sorry. This represents a downward trend in black arts, which must surely cause some marvelous concern. I'll log it out. Oh no. It says I have an error. Okay. How are we doing now? Better? Oh, hi, Anne. Hello. Okay, so I'm better for Ree and not for Sophie again. Soph, I think it might be your internet if it's still bad. Well, I'll reread the last paragraph if you guys missed it. Hopefully. Oh, it's good now? All right, cool. Yeah, we'll push it back to 9 o'clock starting Sunday. So, because it's cut out twice this stream. And I think it is because it's busy. Okay, I'll reread. I'll reread from the top of the page just to make sure you got it all. But what call has he to be walking around in a charmed suit? It is a dazzling attraction charm, directed at ladies, very well done, I admit, and barely detectable even to my trained eye, since it appears to have been darned into the seams, and one which will render him almost irresistible to ladies. This represents a downward trend into black arts, which must surely cause you some motherly concern, Mrs. Pendragon. Sophie thought uneasily about the grey and scarlet suit. She had darned the seams without noticing it, and anything particular about it. But Mrs. Pensiman was an expert on magic, and Sophie was only an expert on clothes. Mrs. Pensiman put both gold mittens on top of her stick and canted her stiff body so that both her trained and piercing eyes stared into Sophie's. Sophie felt more and more nervous and uneasy. My life is nearly over, Mrs. Pensiman announced. I have felt death tiptoeing close for some time now. Oh, I'm sure that isn't so, Sophie said, trying to sound soothing. It was hard to sound like anything with Mrs. Pensiman staring at her like that. I assure you it is so, says Mrs. Pensiman. This is why I was anxious to see you, Mrs. Pendragon. Howl, you see, was my last pupil, and by far my best. I was about to retire when he came to me out of a foreign land. I thought my work was done when I trained Benjamin Sullivan, whom you probably know better as Wizard Sullivan, rest his soul, and procured him the post of royal magician. Oddly enough, he came from the same country as Howl. Then Howl came, and I saw at a glance that he had twice the imagination and twice the abilities, and though I admit he had some faults of character, I knew he was a force for good. Good, Mrs. Pendragon, but what is he now? What indeed, Sophie? Something has happened to him, Mrs. Penstamen said, still staring piercingly at Sophie, and I am determined to put that right before I die. What do you think has happened? Sophie asked uncomfortably. I must rely on you to tell me that, said Mrs. Penstamen. My feeling is that he has gone the same way as the Witch of the Waste. They tell me she was not wicked once, though I have this only on hearsay, since she is older than either of us and keeps herself young by her arts. Howl has gifts in the same order as hers. It seems as if those of high ability cannot resist some extra dangerous stroke of cleverness, which results in a fatal flaw and begins a slow decline to evil. Do you, by any chance, have a clue what it might be? Calcifer's voice came into Sophie's mind, saying, the contract isn't doing either of us any good in the long run. She felt a little chilly in spite of the heat of the day, blowing through the open windows of the shaded, elegant room. Yes, she said, he's made some sort of contract with his fire demon. Mrs. Penstamen's hands shook a little on her stick. That will be it. You must break that contract, Mrs. Pendragon. I would if I knew how, Sophie said. Surely your maternal feelings and your own strong magic gift will tell you how, Mrs. Penstamen said. I have been looking at you, Mrs. Pendragon, though you may not have noticed. Oh, I noticed, Mrs. Penstamen, Sophie said, and I like your gift, said Mrs. Penstamen. It brings life to things, such as that stick in your hand, which you have evidently talked to the extent that it has become what the layman could call a magic wand. I think you would not find it too hard to break that contract. Yes, but I need to know what the terms of it are, Sophie said. Did Hal tell you I was a witch? Because if he did not. There is no need to be coy. You can rely on my experience to know these things, said Mrs. Penstamen. Then to Sophie's relief, she shut her eyes. It was like a strong light being turned off. I do not know, nor do I wish to know about such contracts, she said. Her cane wobbled again, as if she might be shuddering. Her mouth quirked into a line, suggesting she had unexpectedly bitten on a peppercorn. But I now see, she said, what has happened to the witch. She made a contract with a fire demon, and over the years that demon has taken control of her. Demons do not understand good and evil, but they can be bribed into a contract, provided the human offers them something valuable, something only humans have. This prolongs the life of both human and demon, and the human gets the demon's magic power to add to his or her own. Mrs. Penstamen opened her eyes again. This is all I can bear to say on the subject, except to advise you to find out what that demon got. Now I must bid you farewell. I have to rest a while. And like magic, which it probably was, the door opened and the page boy came in to usher Sophie out of the room. Sophie was extremely glad to go. She was all but squirming with embarrassment by then. She looked back at Mrs. Penstamen's rigid, upright form as the door closed and wondered if Mrs. Penstamen would have made her feel this bad if she had really and truly been Hal's old mother. Sophie rather thought she would. I take my hat off to Hal for standing her as a teacher for more than a day, she murmured to herself. Madam? Asked the page boy, thinking Sophie was talking to him. I said, go slowly down the stairs or I can't keep up, Sophie told him. Her knees were wobbling. You young boys dash about so, she said. Tea break. My mouth is so dry today. I've eaten nothing but sugar. Sugar and Easy Mac. So it's been a very unhealthy. And my body is paying. Okay. And Easy Mac's not even good, but it was the only thing there. So how did me buy? Where was I? I need to start learning to putting my finger where I was at before. There we go. The page boy took her slowly and considerately down the shiny stairs. Halfway down, Sophie recovered enough from Mrs. Penstamen's personality to think of some of the things Mrs. Penstamen had actually said. She had said Sophie was a witch. Oddly enough, Sophie accepted this without any trouble at all. That explained the popularity of certain hats, she thought. It explained Jane Farrier's Count Whatsit. It possibly explained the jealousy of the Witch of the Waste. It was as if Sophie had always known this, but she had thought it was not proper to have a magic gift, because she was the eldest of three. Letty had been far more sensible about such things. Then she thought of the grey and scarlet suit, and nearly fell downstairs with dismay. She was the one who had put the charm on that. She could hear herself now murmuring to it. Built to pull in the girls, she had told it. And of course it did. It had charmed Letty that day in the orchard. Yesterday, somewhat disguised, it must have had its secret effect on Miss Angorian, too. Oh dear, Sophie thought. I've gone and doubled the number of hearts he'll have broken. I must get that suit off him somehow. Hal, in that same suit, was waiting in the cool black and white hall with Michael. Michael nudged Hal in a worried way as Sophie came slowly down the stairs behind the page boy. Hal looked saddened. You seem a bit ragged, he said. I think we'd better skip seeing the king. I'll go and blacken my own name when I make your excuses. I can say my wicked ways have made you ill. That could be true from the look of you. Sophie certainly did not wish to see the king, for the thought of what Calcifer had said. The king commanded Hal to go into the waste, and the witch caught him. Sophie's own chance of being young again would have gone too. She shook her head. After Mrs. Penstamen, she said, the king of Ingery will seem just like an ordinary person. And that is the end of chapter 12. So now we are over halfway. There's 21 chapters. And we're on to chapter 13 on Sunday. 13 and 14. Where Sophie is going to go meet the king, which I don't remember at all. Well, my memory's real bad about this book, apparently. But we did all of that in roughly an hour. We did quite well. I will. Very exciting, yeah. I'll try and test a few different things with the Wi-Fi, but if not, I will probably push it back 9 o'clock and see how that goes. If that's no better, I don't know what we'll do. It might just be, and I'll just have to it's kind of annoying. It only happened twice, I think, this stream, which is good at least. I know a couple of streams ago wasn't great. Oh, you caught a bit of it. Would it be better for you if I started later? Because that's what I'm gonna be doing. You look like someone I know. Okay. All right. Well, I think we are done for the night. And I will see you all on Sunday. See you all on Sunday. Have a good night, and I will keep you updated on if we're changing times. Bye, guys.